Good day, everyone. Today, we shall feature the sixth law of leadership by John C. Maxwell, the law of the solid ground. I realized that the problem wasn't them. It was me. I had handled things badly. And on top of that, my attitude wasn't very positive, not good when you're the guy who wrote a book called The Winning Attitude. That's when I realized that I had broken the law of solid ground. For the first time in my life, my people didn't completely trust me. As soon as I realized I was wrong, I publicly apologized to my people and asked for their forgiveness. Your people know when you make mistakes. The real question is whether you're going to fess up. If you do, you can often quickly regain their trust. That's what happened with me once I apologized. And from then on, I made sure to do things right. I learned firsthand that, when it comes to leadership, you just can't take shortcuts, no matter how long you've been leading your people. It didn't take long for me to get back onto solid ground with everyone. As I've explained in Developing the Leader Within You, a leader's history of successes and failures makes a big difference in his credibility. It's a little like earning or spending pocket change. Each time you make a good leadership decision, it puts change into your pocket. Each time you make a poor one, you have to pay out some of your change to the people. Every leader has a certain amount of change in his pocket when he starts in a new leadership position. From then on, he either builds up his change or pays it out. If he makes one bad decision after another, he keeps paying out change. Then one day, after making one last bad decision, he is going to reach into his pocket and realize he is out of change. It doesn't even matter if the blunder was big or small. When you're out of change, you're out as the leader. A leader who keeps making good decisions and keeps recording wins for the organization builds up his change. Then even if he makes a huge blunder, he can still have plenty of change left over. Trust is the foundation of leadership. To build trust, a leader must exemplify these qualities: competence, connection, and character. People will forgive occasional mistakes based on ability, especially if they can see that you're still growing as a leader. But they won't trust someone who has slips in character. In that area, even occasional lapses are lethal. All effective leaders know this truth. PepsiCo chairman and CEO Craig Weatherup acknowledges that people will tolerate honest mistakes, but if you violate their trust, you will find it very difficult to ever regain their confidence. That is one reason that you need to treat trust as your most precious asset. You may fool your boss, but you can never fool your colleagues or subordinates. General H. Norman Schwarzkopf points to the significance of character. Leadership is a potent combination of strategy and character. But if you must be without one, be without strategy. Character and leadership credibility always go hand in hand. Anthony Harrigan, president of the U.S. Business and Industrial Council, said, "The role of character always has been the key factor in the rise and fall of nations." And one can be sure that America is no exception to this rule of history. We won't survive as a country because we are smarter or more sophisticated, but because we are, we hope, stronger inwardly. In short, character is the only effective bulwark against internal and external forces that lead to a country's disintegration or collapse. Character makes trust possible. And trust makes leadership possible. That is the law of solid ground. Character communicates. Whenever you lead people, it's as if they consent to take a journey with you. The way that trip is going to turn out is predicted by your character. With good character, the longer the trip is, the better it gets. But if your character is flawed, the longer the trip is, the worse it will seem to them. Why? Because no one enjoys spending time with someone he doesn't trust. Character communicates many things to followers. Character communicates consistency. Leaders without inner strength can't be counted on day after day because their ability to perform changes constantly. NBA great Jerry West commented, "You can't get too much done in life if you only work on the days when you feel good." If your people don't know what to expect from you as a leader, at some point they won't look to you for leadership. Think about what happened in the late 1980s. Several high-profile Christian leaders stumbled and fell due to moral issues. That lack of consistency compromised their ability to lead their people. In fact, it gave a black eye to every pastor across the nation because it caused people to become suspicious of all church leaders, regardless of their personal track records. The flawed character of those fallen leaders destroyed the foundation for their leadership. When I think of leaders who epitomize consistency of character, the first person who comes to mind is Billy Graham. Regardless of personal religious beliefs, everybody trusts him. Why? Because he has modeled high character for more than half a century. He lives out his values every day. He never makes a commitment unless he is going to keep it. And he goes out of his way to personify integrity. Character communicates potential. John Morley observed, "No man can climb out beyond the limitations of his own character." That's especially true when it comes to leadership. Take, for instance, the case of NHL coach Mike Keenan. As of MID 1997, he had a noteworthy record of professional hockey victories, the fifth greatest number of regular season wins, the third greatest number of playoff victories, 6 division titles, 4 NHL Finals appearances, and 1 Stanley Cup. Yet despite those commendable credentials, Keenan was unable to stay with a single team for any length of time. In 11 and a half seasons, he coached 4 different teams. And after his stint with the 4th team, the St. Louis Blues, he was unable to land a job for a long time. Why? Sports writer E.M. Swift said of Keenan, "The reluctance to hire Keenan is easily explicable. Everywhere he has been, he has alienated players and management. Evidently, his players didn't trust him. Neither did the owners, who were benefiting from seeing their teams win. It seems he kept violating the law of solid ground." Craig Weatherup explains, "You don't build trust by talking about it. You build it by achieving results, always with integrity and in a manner that shows real personal regard for the people with whom you work." When a leader's character is strong, people trust him, and they trust in his ability to release their potential. That not only gives followers hope for the future, but it also promotes a strong belief in themselves and their organization. Character communicates respect. When you don't have strength within, you can't earn respect without. And respect is absolutely essential for lasting leadership. How do leaders earn respect? By making sound decisions, admitting their mistakes when they make them, and putting what's best for their followers and the organization ahead of their personal agendas. Several years ago, a movie was made about the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment and its colonel, Robert Gould Shaw. The film was called Glory, and though some of its plot was fictionalized, the Civil War story of Shaw's journey with his men, and of the respect he earned from them, was real. The movie recounted the formation of this first unit in the Union Army, composed of African American soldiers. Shaw, a white officer, took command of the regiment, oversaw recruiting, selected the white officers, equipped the men, and trained them as soldiers. He drove them hard, knowing that their performance in battle would either vindicate or condemn the value of black people as soldiers and citizens in the minds of many white Northerners. In the process, both the soldiers and Shaw earned one another's respect. A few months after their training was complete, the men of the 54th got the opportunity to prove themselves in the Union assault on Confederate Fort Wagner in South Carolina. Shaw's biographer Russell Duncan said of the attack, "With a final admonition to prove yourselves men." Shaw positioned himself in front and ordered, "Forward." Years later, one soldier remembered that the regiment fought hard because Shaw was in front, not behind. Almost half of the 600 men from the 54th who fought that day were wounded, captured, or killed. Though they fought valiantly, they were unable to take Fort Wagner. And Shaw, who had courageously led his men to the top of the fort's parapet in the first assault, was killed along with his men. Shaw's actions on that final day solidified the respect his men already had for him. 2 weeks after the battle, Albanus Fisher, a sergeant in the 54th, said, "I still feel more eager for this struggle than I ever yet have, for I now wish to have revenge for our gallant Colonel, sick." J. R. Miller once observed, "The only thing that walks back from the tomb with the mourners and refuses to be buried is the character of a man." This is true. What a man is survives him. It can never be buried. Shaw's character, strong to the last, had communicated a level of respect to his men that lived beyond him. A leader's good character builds trust among his followers. But when a leader breaks trust, he forfeits his ability to lead. That's the law of solid ground. I was again reminded of this while listening to a lesson taught by my friend Bill Hybels. 4 times a year, he and I teach a seminar, Leading and Communicating to Change Lives. Bill was conducting a session titled Lessons from a Leadership Nightmare, and he shared observations and insights on some of the leadership mistakes made by Robert McNamara and the Johnson administration during the Vietnam War, the administration's inability to prioritize multiple challenges, its acceptance of faulty assumptions, and Johnson's failure to face serious staff conflicts. But in my opinion, the greatest insight Bill shared during that talk concerned the failure of American leaders, including McNamara, to face and publicly admit the terrible mistakes they had made concerning the war in Vietnam. Their actions broke trust with the American people, and because of that, they violated the law of solid ground. The United States has been suffering from its repercussions ever since. An inherited policy becomes a leadership-shattering problem. Vietnam was already at war when President Kennedy and Robert McNamara, his Secretary of Defense, took office in January of 1961. The Vietnam region had been a battleground for decades, and the United States got involved in the mid-1950s when President Eisenhower sent a small number of U.S. troops to Vietnam as advisors. When Kennedy took office, he continued Eisenhower's policy. It was always his intention to let the South Vietnamese fight and win their own war, but over time, the United States became increasingly involved. Before the war was over, more than 500,000 American troops at a time served in Vietnam, if you remember those war years. You may be surprised to know that American support for the war was very strong even as the number of troops being sent overseas rapidly increased and the casualties mounted. By 1966, more than 200,000 Americans had been sent to Vietnam, yet 2/3 of all Americans surveyed by Lewis Harris believed that Vietnam was the place where the United States should stand and fight communism. And most people expressed the belief that the U.S. should stay until the fight was finished. First trust, then support, but support didn't continue for long. The Vietnam War was being handled very badly. On top of that, our leaders continued the war even after they realized that we couldn't win it. But the worst mistake of all was that McNamara and President Johnson weren't honest with the American people about it. That broke the law of solid ground, and it ultimately destroyed the administration's leadership. In his book In Retrospect, McNamara recounts that he repeatedly minimized American losses and told only half-truths about the war. For example, he says, "Upon my return to Washington, from Saigon, on December 21, 1963, I was less than candid when I reported to the press. I said, we observed the results of a very substantial increase in Viet Cong activity, true, but I then added, we reviewed the plans of the South Vietnamese and we have every reason to believe they will be successful, an overstatement at best." For a while, nobody questioned McNamara's statements because there was no reason to mistrust the country's leadership. But in time, people recognized that his words and the facts weren't matching up. And that's when the American public began to lose faith. Years later, McNamara admitted his failure. We of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations who participated in the decisions on Vietnam acted according to what we thought were the principles and traditions of this nation. We made our decisions in light of those values. Yet we were wrong, terribly wrong. By then, it was too late. Many would argue that McNamara's admission came 30 years and 58,000 lives too late. The cost of Vietnam was high, and not just in human lives. As the American people's trust in their leaders eroded, so did their willingness to follow them. Protests led to open rebellion and to society-wide turmoil. The era that had begun with the hope and idealism characterized by John F. Kennedy ultimately ended with the mistrust and cynicism associated with Richard Nixon. Whenever a leader breaks the law of solid ground, he pays a price in his leadership. McNamara and President Johnson lost the trust of the American people, and their ability to lead suffered as a result. Eventually, McNamara resigned as Secretary of Defense. Johnson, the consummate politician, recognized his weakened position, and he didn't run for re-election. But the repercussions of broken trust didn't end there. The American people's distrust for politicians has continued to this day, and it is still growing. No leader can break trust with his people and expect to keep influencing them. Trust is the foundation of leadership. Violate the law of solid ground, and you're through as a leader.